All right, welcome back to Exponential Awareness. Just going to kind of shoot from the hip with this one. So I had a video removed. And here's the title of the video. The ship is sinking. How long will you stay on board? You can see removed here. Restrictions, terms, and policies. So why was this video removed? Well, in this video, I showed some videos of Ukrainian people that had been captured from the Ukrainian military and their testimonies about their experience in the Ukrainian military. And those stories do not align with what the West is saying. Not at all. In fact, it highlights the disgusting morals and values of the West, that the ends justify the means, regardless of what the means are. While we see on the other side, Russia highly regarding the means to the end, that the end isn't the only thing they're measuring, it's how they get there. Just want to start by sharing that because it's kind of created the Streisand effect in my mind, where now I really want to share this stuff in a strategic way that doesn't get videos removed. Also, it's pushed me to now expand to other platforms, which I had been in deliberation about because it's difficult to create a subscriber base on those channels. Much more difficult than it is on YouTube, just because of the sheer volume of people that are on YouTube versus some of those other platforms. However, if I'm making content and it's getting removed, so people can't even see it, then I might as well join those platforms as well and upload my videos across multiple areas. So that is coming up. So let's jump into the news and show some of this behavior of the West. Now, some of this is just going to be news, and some of it's I'm going to point to what does this tell you about the foundational morals and values of the West, and specifically the U.S. as well, because we know the U.S. is the head of the proverbial beast that is the West. So here's a news update. Apple A16 chips are now made in America. Taiwan-based independent journalist Tim Kolpan revealed that Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, also known as TSMC, plant in Arizona has produced the first batch of Apple A16 chips using the 4 nanometer process, the same process used at TSMC's Taiwan factories. Now, here's an important note about these 4 nanometer chips. Most high-tech military gear does not require this size of chips. Most of our high-tech military gear can use the 20, 30, 40, even 70 nanometer chips for weapon systems. So the question is, what are these incredibly tiny chips actually designed for? You can look into that if you would like. So here we go. Here's a good post. Trust in most U.S. institutions has withered. Percentage of respondents who have a great deal or fair amount of confidence. So you can see the trend down, down, down. Congress, down. Big business, down. Newspapers, down. The presidency, down. Supreme Court, down. The church or organized religion, down, steeply down. The medical system spiked significantly down, and then up and down across the past 3 decades or so. The military, slightly up for a while, but as of late, trending down. I wonder why. Small business, trending up. And acutely, right here, in the very short term, perhaps over the last 4 to 5 years, down, with a slight pivot upwards this year. So again, this goes back to my last video that got removed. The West is sinking. The ship that is the West is sinking. How long will you stay on board? Everybody's losing confidence in the West. The question is why? And that goes back to the same foundational issue of corruption. There is corruption in every facet of the West, which I highlighted in my last video, and I will continue to do so even more now, thanks to censorship, which is corruption of the West. They don't want you to hear any alternative narrative that could offer a different presupposition to what they're trying to paint. And also, in that last video, I shared that some top military individuals are seeking to expand DEI and decrease white representation in the military, while simultaneously, juxtaposed to that, they are trying to increase recruiting numbers. What happens when you end up with a woke military? You spend more time focusing on DEI stuff than the actual mission at hand. The mission becomes DEI instead of defending the Constitution, defending U.S. citizens, defending non-corrupt U.S. interests. But then again, it appears that most of the West and most of the U.S. interests are these days now corrupt. And thus, people don't want to be a part of the military that is corrupt or that is sent to enforce corrupt missions. The Army's top enlisted leader has removed key guidance that required diversity to be considered when selecting individuals to serve in upper-level, non-commissioned officer positions. Sergeant Major of the Army, Michael Weimer, the top enlisted leader of the force, recently issued new guidance on selecting command sergeants, majors, that was essentially copy and pasted from his predecessor, with one exception. It removes a line directing that a command sergeant major candidate's diversity be considered. And considering a candidate's diversity in any facet itself is discrimination based on race, sex, religion, whatever. It's literally discrimination. So the interesting thing about diversity, equity, and inclusion is it's aimed at decreasing discrimination, but by the very nature of focusing on diversity of candidates, you are discriminating, and thus it becomes a self-defeating issue. It becomes a hypocrisy. And this is what people in the West are getting sick of. Most of Weimer's newly released guidance is unchanged and relatively pedestrian, such as a loose requirement for top enlisted leaders in airborne roles to be jump masters, and physical fitness being a determining factor. No way! Almost like your knowledge, skills, and abilities should be what is considered for a position in the military or anywhere in life. What can you do? What do you know? Are you a right fit based on what you can do and what you know for the position and what's required? Shocking. So here is a map, and I'll blow it up here in a minute. The left map, U.S. drug deaths per capita in 1999. The red is more deaths per capita. Shortly before U.S. policymakers, like Summers, pursued policies like China and the World Trade Organization. China, one of the biggest producers of pharmaceuticals and illegal drugs in the world, along with the cartels in Central America and South America. To reduce inflation, that was the big thing we were sold at. We're going to bring China into the World Trade Organization and it's going to decrease inflation because we're going to globalize things and it's much cheaper to produce things over there than it is here. Unintended consequence. To reduce inflation by subjugating the U.S. working and middle class. To support the U.S. tea market and Wall Street. The whole ends justify the means thing is not just on a militaristic war front, but also on an economic war front. The rich are okay with that. This looks like an inflamed, cancerous body that is decaying. And this goes back to the title of my last video. The ship is sinking. How long will you stay on board? In less than 20 years, we went from this to this. And this is 2014, right? We don't have the last decade of information incorporated in here. Have you seen drug use become worse or better in the last 10 years? So do you think this map has gotten worse or better? Folks, I'm telling you, if you're sitting here thinking you're going to get a certain presidential candidate elected or a certain governor elected or this congressman or this senator and things will change or whatever, that's not going to happen. You have to look at the foundation on which all that stuff is built upon. You have to look at the foundation of the people voting for all of this stuff. And when you look at the foundation, the morals, the values, the ethics of a country, what was the change from here to here? Did you see worsening morals, worsening values, worsening ethics, or improvement of all those factors, or all those aspects? So if you think you're going to plug in a governor here, 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 and that's going to fix things, nope, that's not it. That's a false hope. That's a narrative you're being fed to keep you here, to keep you in the prison system, to keep you paying taxes, to keep you supporting the system and keeping the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer and destroying your lives. That's cut and dry. That's what it is. And so if you're not formulating some sort of escape plan at this point, there's coming a time where I think it's going to be very difficult for anyone from the US to leave, because they can't afford to have that intellectual capital leave. They need people that know how to run operations to stay. They need people in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to stay. So while we see our open borders and people flooding in right now, I think there's coming a time where, yes, the borders are going to get cut off, but not just for people coming in, but for people leaving and going elsewhere as well. And I'll have some posts in here that demonstrate that I have been extremely accurate over my past few videos and on other channels that I had in the past that point to this. Next post, German decision to close its nuclear power plants but keep coal power plants instead will go into history books as the dumbest environmental, geopolitical, and economic decision in Europe since World War II. But what most people are missing is exactly what I shared in what is now my last video, because the other one's been removed. There is weapon systems out there that cannot be utilized with nuclear power spread across the world because they trigger a nuclear cascade event like we saw in Chernobyl, which was caused by this technology. And so in order to be able to utilize this technology, they need to deactivate nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants. Apparently, over 700 former high-ranking national security officials have endorsed Kamala Harris for president. Now we see Biden out there, and clearly he does not have any capacity to be in the presidential position, but he is. And many people have speculated, I think to much accuracy, that he is not actually running the country and that there is a deep state behind him running it, and he's simply a figurehead. This goes back to the question, ship is sinking. How long are you going to stay? We have a modern day Praetorian Guard in effect. If you want to go look at the Praetorian Guard in the Roman Empire, the last 200 years of the Roman Empire, and what role the Praetorian Guard played, we have that today in the West. The Praetorian Guard essentially was who you had to pay off and who you had to please in order to be the Caesar. And you could get put in the position of Caesar, and someone more wealthier or offering a better value proposition could then get the Praetorian Guard to remove you from that position and insert you. So who was really running Rome? Well, it was the Praetorian Guard and the leaders of the Praetorian Guard. That's our national security state agencies that we have these days. Here's another piece. It reads, the Russian, Iranian, North Korean axis of the sanctioned and their growing military cooperation do not seem to represent a severe threat to the West. Although all three countries use the same anti-Western rhetoric, on the ground they do not take any steps that could cause major damage to Western geopolitical interests. This post that this article that this person shared reads, Putin's non-existent red lines could lead Russia into a nuclear abyss. And based on the technology in the video I shared last, I don't think Russia wants to use nuclear weapons. I think they want to use their other weapon system, but they are unable to do this with nuclear weapons scattered about the earth, because utilizing it in too close of a proximity to nuclear material will cause nuclear events to transpire. And thus, they can't use it. I think they really want to, what they're really after is disarmament of nuclear weapons. And I think these red lines are very real, but everybody knows once you cross that nuclear threshold, there is no going back. It'll be an exponential escalation. Another piece here, a video shares Wall Street private equity firms are now buying up American mobile home parks and skyrocketing rents up to 60% on people. These communities have become the target of a new kind of landlord, private equity. Private equity firms are increasingly getting involved. Some of the biggest investors in America have moved into this industry. People living at a local mobile home park are outraged over the sharp increase in lot rents. Rents were raised by nearly 60%. From one resident, I worked for 45 years. There is no American dream anymore. All it is survival. Homes of America has gone up on, this is a bad quote. Homes of America has gone on a buying spree, spending nearly $300 million to acquire 138 parks across 17 states. They raised rents and aggressively evicted residents. And that's just one firm buying. There are many more. One resident says, I don't know what I'm going to do. Hope that I don't wake up tomorrow. Death crossed my mind. She can only afford one more month of rent. So here's an interesting data point. You can go to Russia right now on a tourist visa for 3 years. You can live comfortably in Russia's most expensive cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg for $1,300 a month, very comfortably. $500 to $600 to $700 a month rent. $150 a month for one person for groceries. Obviously expand that if you have 2 people or 3 people or 4 people. Utilities, $40 to $50 a month. Phone plan, $10 to $20 a month. Entertainment, well, that's up to you and how much you go out and what you want to do, but I've seen many people saying they spend $100 a month on entertainment. Vehicles, well, in those 2 major cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, many people don't own a vehicle because the public transportation system is so amazing. Now, when you get outside the city, yes, or the city centers, yes, a lot of people purchase vehicles, have vehicles, get around, drive longer distances regularly. But again, we're talking about $1,500, $2,000 USD, the current USD exchange rate to purchase a decent vehicle. So all in all, you can live very comfortably in Russia on $18,000 a year USD. So if you have a passive income of 13, 1400, 1500 US dollars a month, you can go there and live very comfortably. And yes, there are legal ways to get your money into Russia still. And here's another note. There are some Russian banks that offer 10%, 15%, and even up to 20% savings rates, interest rates on savings accounts. So let's say you move 15,000 US dollars into one of those banks in Russia and live only off the interest rate. You could live very comfortably. And that's on a 3-month basis, those interest rates. So $15,000, 10%, you earn $1,500 for those 3 months. So if you're talking about on a monthly basis, well, can you move $45,000 into one of those bank accounts and thus live on that interest across there? And that's not even including, do you have a passive income? Do you have a retirement that you're collecting? Do you have Social Security benefits that you're collecting? Do you have any sort of other passive income that equals 1,300 to 1,500 US dollars a month? And you can go live very comfortably there. And yes, I know people are going to say, oh, you're just a Russia bro, Russia shield, whatever, you're probably paid. No, I'm not. I'm just a regular dude that's looking at the state of the US. Where's that quote at here? There is no American dream anymore. All it is survival. This person says they worked for 45 years and all they're left doing is just trying to survive and getting pushed out by these private equity firms who are raising rent prices 60%. That is not a thing that exists in Russia. I don't have the website right now pulled up and I'm not going to try to dig through it, but there's a website where you can go look at rentals or properties to purchase in Russia. There's some limited zones where non-citizens, non-Russian citizens can't purchase property, but you can rent in downtown Moscow if you want for the equivalent of 500, 600 USD a month and live very comfortably for 1,300 USD a month. Now, many people are scared of such an idea because they say, well, I don't speak Russian. The Russians don't like Americans. Go look up YouTube. There's plenty of videos out there of average people who are expats or immigrants from the West that will show you the Russians are very friendly towards Western people if they don't bring that Western crap with them. And if they will acclimatize, if you will, the word's escaping me right now, but if they will adopt Russian values and behave in a conservative, appropriate manner in public, no issues. Russian people are very friendly. And many Russians, especially those under the age of 35, speak English. And there's many who are willing to teach Russian and share Russian values and share Russian history. And yet they've been painted as the boogeyman. And the real question is, who's the boogeyman? Look at this nonsense going on in the United States. Look at what happened to my video. They don't want you to share anything that contradicts the narrative. Assimilate. If you'll assimilate to Russian culture, there's no problems. None at all. From Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, with an interview with Sky News Arabia from September 20th. Here's some points from that interview. African, Asian, and Latin American countries became apprehensive after the West started using the neo 1930s and 40s small mustache movement, Ukrainian regime, as a tool for fighting against Russia. Exactly. The West has the idea that the ends justify the means regardless of those means. That in the end, propagating the West is so important that we can commit atrocities and do immoral things in the process. As a tool for fighting against Russia, everyone started wondering on whom Washington would vent its discontent next time, and whom it might dislike. Well, it can dislike anybody. Exactly. The United States wants to convince everyone that it is a hegemon and that no one dares to challenge it, regardless of their actions. Consequently, the US is saying that it is necessary to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia on the battlefield. They see this as an existential threat for themselves, a threat to their hegemony, a threat to their culture, which their culture is greed, their culture is hedonism. The US culture is immoral, disgusting behavior, is tyrannical behavior. What is happening between Palestine and Israel is shocking. Experts struggle to recall a tragedy or humanitarian catastrophe like this. The terrorist attack that took place on the 7th of October 2023 was outrageous. However, it is unacceptable to respond to a crime with another crime, especially through the prohibited method of collective punishment of civilians. So Russia's saying this is the moral behavior. And what do we see? Well, we see in the SMO, the Special Military Occupation, or the war between Ukraine and Russia, we see Ukraine targeting civilians. We see Ukraine behaving very poorly towards civilians and poorly towards Russian captives. And we see the opposite of that from Russia. BRICS is an association based on respectful attitude towards each other and on a mutual consideration for each other's interests. There is no such principle in the European Union or NATO. The US is the hegemon there. It tolerates no objections with regards to its policies. The EU has established a bureaucracy that tells sovereign countries what to do. The people did not vote for this bureaucracy. European bureaucracy is obediently following the course set by the US, but more and more EU countries are coming to see that this is not in their interests, but in the interests of their overseas partner. Saudi Arabia, once a pillar of the petrodollar system, may be secretly amassing gold reserves as central banks worldwide quietly buy up the precious metal. Let's go ahead and take a look at gold. So this is not financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm just going to go ahead and share some things. So here is something I have never seen anybody else in the world talk about. Okay, so what do people buy and sell on as a key performance indicator of their portfolio, of a stock, of gold, of commodities, of equities, whatever? What do people trade on? Well, they trade on percentages. So in order to understand the movement in percentages, you have to use a logarithmic function, not a regular function. Because if you do, it's very difficult to actually identify trends. They don't make any sense. However, if you use a logarithmic function that works on percentages, all of a sudden, there's some trends you can work off of. So I drew these green boxes back in 2017 or 2016-ish time frame when this first pivot move happened. And I drew it based on Fibonacci's algorithm and Elliott wave theory. So as an example of how this works, this will be a clearer picture. Let's look at the S&P 500. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this chart, and I'll go ahead and explain it here. So this is the Great Depression pivot, which launched all of this. If you look at the trend before the Great Depression, you have these two red lines. That was the trend. It broke outside of that trend. Basically, things were overvalued, and then it collapsed to a point where things were vastly undervalued and pivoted up and pivoted down to create the first count wave. So when I say first count, using Elliott wave theory, that's the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, why is this important? Well, Elliott wave theory provides the structure of the movement of the market. So within this, you see this pivot here in which stock prices on the S&P 500 index move up to this middle blue line here and then reject down because they were overvalued, and then they move to an undervalued position. It moves outside of this blue line here. Let me go ahead and shrink my screen down so you can see it all. Apologies for that. Right, so again, here's the red trend line of how things were before the central bank. Right, so we're on a nice trajectory. Central bank was created in 1930, started pumping liquidity into the marketplaces. Fractional reserve banking overvalued things, and then they all collapsed because everybody realized things were overvalued. Time to sell and get out of it. 1930s, Great Depression, bounced back, and sent this trajectory. And again, so what we were explaining here was this blue line here. This is a trend line. See, the highs and lows are pretty much all captured between these two trend lines here, until it reaches a point where it became so overvalued from this low here to this high that it corrected sideways through the stagflation of the 1970s, and then collapsed outside of that blue line, got too undervalued, and started pivoting again. And notice it pivoted right around this yellow line, and the pivot started at the depths of the Great Depression. Pivoted just outside this yellow line, starts increasing again, following this yellow line, stays inside these new red lines here, becomes overvalued, rejects that back down to the red line, again builds its way back up, way overvalued, corrects back down just outside the red line, comes back up to test getting back inside that trend, rejects on the back side of this red trend line, and where does it come? Right back down to this long-term yellow trend line that's based on the pivot of the low of the Great Depression. And so after it hits that yellow line, what does it do? Well, it starts forming a new trend channel. It comes right back up, pivots down. So that's where our top of our trend line is formed. And we make this line based off of the bottom pivot here. And what do we see? It works back up to this yellow or this blue trend line. It works back up to this blue trend line and rejects. Works back up to this blue line and rejects. Works back up to this blue trend line and rejects. Works back up to this blue trend line, becomes overvalued, and we have this micro depression or this micro recession that we had in 2022, rejects back down, and look at this. We're right back up to the top of this blue trend line, and we can look at this at a smaller and smaller scale. Right, so we can go down to a one day scale. And we can see the same patterns on a micro scale. Right, so we have these trend lines. Breaks outside of this orange trend line, becomes overvalued, and what does it do? It rejects down outside of it and sets a new trend again and again and again. You can go down to 1 minute and see these trend lines. I'll zoom out a little bit just to draw the initial ones. I haven't done this in quite a while, but the same trend lines. There's nothing special happening here, folks. So we see this one in this deep two, which is basically a complete rejection. So let's go ahead and draw some trend lines here. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. So let's say we think this is going to be our 1, 2 here. Actually, this would be our 1, 2. Let's say we think this was our 1, 2 here. Shrink this down. So if I think this is my 1, 2, and this next thing is my 1, 2 of my bigger wave, well then I can go 3, 4, this thing's right in the way, 5. And you notice the shape looks like that classic stock market shape that plays over and over again and again. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that shape exists? Something to that effect, maybe. And this will complete a wave series that likely captures the lows and highs between this trend channel. It will get overbought, overvalued. It'll correct. It'll take one more run up, but then it will be so overvalued based on this pivot point that you'll then have correction down. So let me go ahead and select this. You'll have a correction down. You'll have a B, and a C. And guess what? That'll form a trend line. It then goes out this way, another trend line. And this will be the 1, 2 on a larger scale. So we zoom out. So it could do something like that. However, we're getting to the end of this long-term trend line somewhere in here. And it works up and down. Right? So I did the same thing here. 1, 2 pivot, oversold, undervalued. What did it do? It bounced up the other way, just like we saw with the Great Depression. This trend line, and it dropped way too far out, corrected, and now it's off and setting a 1, 2 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Some of that effect, right? And what's that do? It takes it over, it'll be overvalued on this blue trend line here. And so if we zoom out to that blue trend line, what do we see? Well, let's do the same thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It completes that wave. So if that's the end of that, then we see a 1, 2 happening here, and we end up with a, let's say, A, B, C, something of that effect. The only question is, at some point, this thing gets overvalued on the biggest scales. When I say the biggest scales, I mean the biggest trend line. So we zoomed in and we saw a trend line here, which took us to the blue one. And the blue one takes us to the green one. And the green one takes us to this larger blue one here. The larger blue one, you zoom back out. Well, on the larger blue one that pivoted off the housing market crash, correction back to this yellow line, well, that's getting up towards this middle yellow line, which is the biggest trend section going back to the Great Depression. And so it's getting overvalued on that level. So at some point you have to have this correction that brings you back to the yellow line. And the more this builds up here, A, the harder the fall, but B, the more likely, the more probable that we're going to have a stock market collapse. And so why am I talking about this in the context of gold? Well, here the GFC really started in October of 07, but it was finally announced, October of 2008, so way after the stock market had corrected. The dot-com bubble really started in September of 2000, but where did we hear the announcement? October 2001 timeframe. How about here? 87 is when the 88, 89 recession really happened. 73, January 73, but we didn't hear about it until later in 73, October timeframe. Here in 68, but the depth was really in June 70, so when the correction started here versus where it's at. So you have to look at the trend lines to understand where the stock market is, and the stock market will tell you something about gold, because what is gold's actual function? Well, people say preservation of wealth as sort of just the parroted piece of gold, but yes, that is true. I should say yes, but that's true. But what is gold actually allowing people who have gold to do? Well, theoretically, you buy gold and the price goes up. And when you need liquidity, when you need dollars, you sell the gold to get dollars to pay for stuff. So under what circumstances would people need gold for liquidity, for dollars? Well, they would need it during recessions when banks aren't lending because there's a lot of risk in the system. Banks will always lend as long as their risk reward payoff makes sense. But if there's risk in the system, i.e. a recession or depression on the horizon, interest rates go up because banks don't want to lend money out because the likelihood, the probability of that money being able to be repaid decreases because recessionary activity, businesses going out of business, people losing their jobs. So it's more risky to lend money. Likewise, the Federal Reserve is going to give you 5%, 5.5% to park its money there with no risk versus 8% on a 30-year fixed mortgage with significant risk, near-term risk of a recession. The easy thing is to say, well, I'm going to take 5%, 5.5%. Yeah, I'll lose out on that 3% on that 30-year mortgage, but I'm also not taking any risk by doing that. So what do people do? Well, when they lose their jobs, when businesses go out of business, when people need liquidity, they sell their gold. At the height of the great financial crisis in 2008, that's when gold prices started coming down. Why? Because they needed dollars. So they started selling their gold. What's that do? Well, that puts more gold on the market, supply and demand, the price comes down. And when did it turn around? Right before the last boom really happened, 2015, right? Right around this time frame, we saw growth start happening again in the US, and so it starts slowing down and it pivots and goes the opposite direction. A big sell-off here in March of 08, 4 or 5 months after the October announcement of the recession, a lot of people needed liquidity. A lot of people of high net worth started picking up gold because it was cheap. And then presumably those people, plus other people who were not of high net worth at that time, started selling because they needed liquidity. They needed dollars. So how come during the dot-com bubble people were buying? Well, interest rates stayed low. They did not increase interest rates. You did not see an inversion of the yield curve. So therefore, you could still get dollars, liquidity, very cheap. You see, when liquidity conditions are expensive, i.e. interest rates are high, people sell their gold to get cash. 1980, right? During the recession, or right before the recession, people were selling to get cash. People were selling to get cash. 83, people were selling to get cash. 87, people were selling to get cash. Stagflation 73, people were selling to get cash. People were selling to get cash. 74, people were selling this whole time frame through 76 to get cash. So everybody right now is saying buy gold, buy gold, buy gold, all-time highs. Well, what happens when things are at all-time highs? Boom. 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 So only fools purchase things when they're at all-time highs. Because what follows all-time highs historically? Crashes. Corrections in price between these trend lines. So looking at gold here, let's say we think this is the 1-2 of gold. We draw a trend line. Go ahead and change the color here. Change the color, make it nice and thick. Oh, that's gray, I meant blue. All right, so let's say that's the 1-2. We can already see it's struggling to stay in this trend line here. Dropped out here, overvalued, dropped out again, struggled, dropped out again. It is struggling to keep the price up. That means people are selling gold and silver, precious metals, to get liquidity. Yes, it's spiked up right now, but this is exactly what I'm looking at before a significant correction. Correction down to where? We also have these earned moving average lines that are based on 144 candles, 169 candles, and 233 candles, which are Fibonacci targets. You see how when it spikes above these lines for quite some time, it then corrects back down underneath them and then rides them before it builds momentum, right? Overvalued, undervalued. Market trying to decide what it wants to do. Overvalued, undervalued. Spike up way, see this gap right here? See the gap right here? Spiked. What comes after? At least a correction back into touching these earned move average lines. The faster and the steeper it spikes, the more sudden the drop. And when it drops, it usually sinks under until it finds a buyer at a trend line. So it's spiked right now up to this blue line. I would expect it to at least come down under the blue line, which would neatly match these earned moving average lines right at the bottom of that trend line. I would at least expect it to come back to there, if not come under to maybe the bottom of this yellow line and maybe test and rebound and perhaps down to this long-term yellow trend line. Again, not financial advice. I'm just showing you trends in the system. Things are constantly pivoting back and forth like a pendulum in all things. We see it in our society right now. We saw the pendulum swing towards conservatism in the 1950s, and the reactionary rebellion against that towards leftism through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now. And what do we see? We see the rebellion against what is now the status quo and the norm, which was a pendulum swing away from that stuff. We see the pendulum swinging back towards conservatism. People longing for conservative values. More and more people heading that way. And even willing to leave their countries to go to places where those values are upheld, where people enjoy having those values. Back to the news. Again, here in the West, Amazon sells these houses for $19,000 because no one can afford a real home anymore. So now you can have this nice prison cell if you can afford to put it on a piece of property somewhere, which is going to cost you $150,000, $200,000 for an acre. So you can buy your $19,000 home and put it on a $200,000 1 acre parcel of land somewhere. $200,000 in Russia will buy you a mansion. $19,000 in Russia will buy you a very nice house in the countryside if you want. With acreage, 4, 5, 6 acres. Messaging app Telegram will provide users' IP addresses and phone numbers to relevant authorities in response to valid legal requests, according to Chief Executive Officer Pavel Durov. This points to something I've been speculating on for quite some time. Is Telegram really a honeypot? And they stand up people and act as if it's opposition, but really it's controlled opposition. I don't know. Very interesting that this person had a absolutely not, will not give up information stance, and now working with authorities. U.S. is urging U.S. citizens in Lebanon to depart while commercial options are still available. What do you think that is forecasting? What do we see in Afghanistan and other areas over the last several years when stuff's about to happen? And as I predicted, Turkey is demonstrating that it wants to move away from the West and join BRICS and other alliances that are strategically against the West. And what do I think is coming for Turkey based on that? Well, I think they'll be removed from NATO. The Times of London is attacking academics who speak truth to power. No surprise there. I mean, what did they do to my little channel? I told the truth. Got a video removed. Here, Pennsylvania Governor Shapiro says we must all do our part in the fight for freedom. Well, do you feel like you have freedom in the West? Do you feel like you have freedom in the West? Do you feel like you have freedom in the West with all this stuff going on? You have freedom to suffer, freedom to be a slave, freedom to barely be able to afford just to survive. We must all do our part in the fight for freedom. This narrative is silly. I mean, you've got to be in a deep state of a trance to think we still have freedom and an American dream here in the U.S. From the workers in Scranton who make Pennsylvania the arsenal of democracy to the brave Ukrainian soldiers protecting their country. And if my video was still up, you would have seen that the brave soldiers of Ukraine, many of them are prisoners who were imprisoned on false allegations just to make them prisoners because they were dodging the draft. And they had false charges of other stuff brought against them just to make them prisoners. And then this dude, the artist, as he's nicknamed, came and purchased their freedom, but their freedom was really you get to go fight in the war in Ukraine and become marauders for us and loot and bring those goods back to us or back to him. Like, it's just absolute madness. These dudes in suits and ties saying, we got freedom you got to fight for. No, you got to pay for their massive bank accounts and their yachts and their flights all over the world. It's just absolute silliness. All right, here we go. Here's another post. The new Dragon Age from EA Games and BioWare, the makers of Mass Effect, will let you design a they/them pronouns character with transgender top surgery scars. It's being lauded as the wokest video game ever made. Here's the West for you. Is this what you want to stay on? The ship is sinking. Do you think this stuff will be able to withstand against what's been infused into our country over the last few years? Do you think this stuff will be able to stand against countries and nations that are built on strong values? I mean, do you think this person would ever be able to contribute if there was a serious war with those countries? No. This person's doing nothing that's added value in that situation. And we have tens of millions of these type of people here in the US. In Australia, they're pushing the digital ID more and more. And here's a post that says the Pentagon's obsession to get the IP addresses of Anon accounts on Telegram reminds me of the time the Pentagon spent $500 million of taxpayer money making slick pro-ISIS propaganda videos. When they got caught, they said it was to get the IP addresses of people who like ISIS vids. I'm telling you, I think Telegram is a honeypot that the NSA is just collecting data on. So be careful what you say. Be careful what you view. And have a plan to tell why you're doing what you're doing and why you're on the app. Because I think there's a time coming where they're going to target people sharing information, liking information, and that are part of groups. Just so you know. That is all I have for this video. Quite lengthy, but I think, hopefully, adding value for you all. So if it did add value, please like, please subscribe, please share this with people that you think will also find value in this channel and in these videos. And until next time, stay exponentially aware.